the other thing that happens in these tumultuous times financially is you also get a lot of geopolitical reshuffling, right? When one superpower starts to decline, well, the numbers 2 and 3 and 4, et cetera, start to rise up, and so sometimes the trade wars escalate into kinetic wars. We've also seen a commensurate rising in tension in the past few years, particularly after the pandemic. A lot of money printing, a lot of supply chain disruptions, a lot of posturing, economic posturing, sanctions, all of these things. So all the tensions have been rising, and we've had the rise in some hot conflict as well. So if we're looking at, I guess we're looking at the United States, Russia, China, I don't know, anyone else you want to throw in this evaluation, how do you see the geopolitical landscape reconfiguring itself as a result of where we are today?
Yeah, I think we're going through one of those major reconfigurations, the likes of which we haven't had since World War II. And, I'll get into that a little bit, but yeah, just to your point, like that is when those types of massive things happen, right? Like in a status quo situation, the government tried to take away 10% of everything or 90% of everything everybody owns, or do a DTCC great taking. That's not when those things happen. You needed something like the Great Depression, where there's 25% unemployment, and the economy is totally in deep depression, for them to do that revaluation. Or you needed, in the Soviet Union, a communist revolution, when they come in and take the assets, or they nationalize things. So we need this. This is the danger, is we're getting to this time where this is what is money, and money's connected to everything, right? And the geopolitical and the economic are closely woven together. You're seeing it in, I believe, the Trump administration plan that's being done, but it's right now, it's the whole reordering. And it's an attempt, I believe, to kind of pull back from this global hegemonic system of the United States, pull away from Europe, pull away from Asia even, focus more on Western Hemisphere type stuff. And this is, what's dangerous about it is it's in this shakeup period time. And that's when, stuff happens, right? I forget the author's name, wrote an amazing book, but it focuses around like elites, counter elites, how there's like an overbreeding of counter elites that happens periodically. And what happens is it's like a reverse game of musical chairs, where there's only so many power positions in a society. And as the elite class grows, the competition for those chairs gets more and more intense, to a point where normally the elites can get along and play nice with each other. But when the chairs competition gets so heated, you get the rise of the counter elites. And these are actually population demographic type things, where you get too many people that, are kind of born into elite circles, and they're wanting to continue in that, and the power seats aren't just available. And you see what's happening with like AI and different things. You could even see that accelerating. I mean, like in our country, for example, we have the same number of Congress people as we've had for a long time, but how has our population grown? The number of ultra wealthy grow. And they all want to get into these power positions, and you get these cycles. And he learned about this from looking at insect colony collapse, where he couldn't figure out, like, why are these healthy, successful colonies growing like gangbusters and then they collapse? And it was like basically certain insects that were responsible for like higher levels of the colony, they overbred themselves, and then they kill each other. And then when they kill each other, like everything else collapses below it.
Interesting.
And so, and he tried to time this by looking at birth rates, and it's like, okay, guess when like France had like a huge birth rate expansion, and the over elites happened, and then the French Revolution happened, and go back through history and notice these correlations between demographic growth of elites leading into these moments, because it was really the elites that drove it. It wasn't the common man getting the short end of the stick so much that he revolted on the streets. It was actually driven by elites not being able to perpetuate their elitism.
Interesting.
Because of the lack of power positions available that drove to these things. And so if we're driving into something like that in a geopolitical landscape, I think there's a path and a hope that we can get through it without a world war.
Yeah.
But I personally believe if nuclear weapons didn't exist, we'd have already entered into massive global wars. Like there's a lid being kept on things because of that threat. And so this is kind of a little bit uncharted territory, that we're going into. The first, maybe one of these overheating of this elite cycle in the nuclear age. And so how it's all going to turn out, I mean, that's a question for the ages. I have thoughts on it, but it's a whole nother thing to get into, which we can. But
that's a fascinating perspective.
That's where we're at.
I've never heard of that, but it does resonate a lot with just this idea that economic scarcity is one of the prime motivators for conflict. Like we can sit here and get along and have a nice conversation, but if you strip two people naked, throw them into the middle of the jungle in the middle of the night, it's like, well, they're going to lose their manners pretty quickly, right? They're just going to kind of shift into basic survival mode. So that's because that's a situation and conditions of acute economic scarcity. People will start to behave much more like animals versus in a conditions of relative economic abundance, we act more civilized. But the reason that resonates with what you're saying is because there's rising demand for these few seats of power, right? In terms of a growing population, but the proportion of those seats is fixed basically. So the proportion is actually shrinking relative. And I guess a healthy response to that would be the societies would fork, right? You'd kind of have like, oh, maybe country A becomes country B and C, and then they each have their own little circles of power. So they increase the number of seats and reduce the scarcity of those positions of power. But something is preventing that. I don't know, maybe we're back to the money printing kind of driving centralization rather than enabling decentralization. And that seems to be pretty scary because I don't know. I mean, we'll see. Like, do you think we could see nations start to fragment? Like, I'm thinking now of Soviet Russia, when it went bankrupt, it basically shattered into 30 some odd countries. If we do have these nation state bankruptcies, which Bitcoin again could be an accelerant to, maybe we will see some of this fracturing of nation states into more countries.
Well, I think you will. And I think it does tie into money, and it does tie into the money printing, right? Because the more the money printing, the more you're getting the situation of wealth inequality, right? And so the number of people in these elite positions, there's a Wall Street Journal article just today about the explosion in the number of billionaires, right? So you've got these same number of power seats. When Forbes first started doing the rankings, it was 200-300 billionaires in the world. Now there's like 3,000. And then they're like the rise of the super billionaire. And there's like 24 people in the world with wealth over $50 billion when, not too long ago, nobody had 50 billion.
Yeah.
So you're getting this expansion of the elites. Now, how could we fracture in, nation states? Yes, that's possible. But even in our own country, right? I could see, and I think it's starting to happen, is a greater differentiation state by state.
Oh yeah, that's already for sure. Texas is a different country than New York right now.
And people, at least we have a little bit of a nice release valve, right?
Yeah.
Like you could be like, hey, I can't stand the red side. I'm going to a blue state. I can't stand the blue state. I'm going to a red state. And we're seeing migration. We're seeing migration within the state.
There's more migration to Miami than any other city in the country post-pandemic.
Yeah,
like people from New York and LA just pouring here.
And a lot of that is economic, but it's also political. And then what's the difference between the economic and the political in one sense? So we're getting that. And then in other places that aren't fortunate to have, the third largest landmass, the United States, third largest sovereign nation on the planet, where you can move to different parts and have a totally different set of rules and laws and cultural norms are different. You are going to get into trouble. And I think, in Europe is probably where that gets really dicey, right? Because a lot of those countries are highly populated, highly dense, but they don't have tons of land.
Yeah.
Now they have the EU. So maybe we start seeing people say, well, like I'm born Spanish, but really I want to be in a more like free market orientated place and I'm moving to Poland or, and, so we're seeing some of these Eastern European countries that are part of the EU really thrive. Like Poland, like other than China, I think they have the best GDP growth in the last 10 years. Wow. They spend over like 4 or 5% on defense. You know, they have like a free market economy there. They have, you know, cultural norms that people respect, and they don't have that. They have a cultural homogeneity that's also created by their Roman Catholic allegiance that most of them have, and so there's a cohesiveness there, and so I think we will start to see that, and there is a lot more migration in the world, and so maybe that's a hope, so that it doesn't have to, you know, come to guns blazing.
Yeah.
Is that it's a lot easier than it was 150 years ago to go move to another nation or another state.
Yeah. No, that's a good point. I mean, yeah, I mean, physical mobility obviously has been augmented in a positive way by technology, airlines, and et cetera. You know, people's ability to discover one another and to discover the right place to live has obviously been improved through digital technologies and whatnot. So maybe we do get more of a self-organizing impulse in the world, which that seems like it could be a good thing for social cohesion. I don't know. I still don't know if that would lead to the existing nation states cohering more strongly, or that would lead to, because, you know, I think it's in Texas's state charter that they can secede and become their own country. And, you know, there's already been this conflict between Texas and the federal government about the immigrants coming in from Mexico. Like, if you get a few more of those conflicts, you probably just see that happen. And then if Texas does it, you've now set this precedent for all these other states that are like, you know what, we've had enough of this. Yeah. And then you start seeing it in the United States. Maybe you see it elsewhere. I don't know. Like, it's again, these are scary thoughts for people. They're like, they can't handle it. They want there to be stability in, you know, the way the world is organized. But you know, again, I hate to be the bearer of bad news, but that's just not the case, right? It's just not the case. That this thing is, changeable, to say the least.
Lines on the map change all the time, and I don't know how it ends. I think these are release valves, like, you know, kind of mitigation strategies that are available short of these massive, like, succession from countries or civil wars or things. So, but I do see, and you see it. It happens in social media. It happens in, like, a polarization and a more, you know, desire to, you know, move away from, like, I think John Mearsheimer talks about this really well when he talks about, it's like you have this fundamental disagreement on first principles. And if you're coming at things with fundamental disagreements on first principles, it's very hard to resolve that, right? And also, you know, at one point in time, maybe there was like a overarching Christian ethos or something, or, you know, there was something that harkened back to a similar first principle. And once people just have wildly divergent first principles, you know, somebody, you know, atheist type principles,
monotheism, polytheism, something like that.
All these different things are, or, you know, collectivism and individualism and socialism and economic first principles. And how important should equality be versus, you know, freedom or liberty, and how do you do those trade-offs? And you start getting the disagreements on those first principles. They're not really reconcilable by reason. And so you get into a situation where maybe the best thing, the least violent way to handle it would be people go do their own thing in their own places. And, you know, I'm not sure that would necessarily be a bad thing if it was handled peacefully and done well. But on the other hand, you have these power structures in place, right, that don't want that fragmentation to happen because it's their fiefdoms and
their tax base.
And so I think it's a little naive and optimistic to just hope that everybody's gonna, you know, find their own place where they got their groove on, and it's just gonna all work out. You know,
that's back to kind of the tax revolt topic. You know, that there is this inherent tension that wants to pull some of these jurisdictions apart, but there's the top down. The tax authority basically wants to keep it together because that's a larger customer base. If I'm using customer in big air quotes here, tax base. And so, I guess, and this is where I think books like The Sovereign Individual really get to the heart of the matter when they talk about the economics of force or violence or coercion. It's like, how economically efficient can the tax collector be in extracting from its tax base, you know, and if the enforcement points become too wide, or if the manner of preserving purchasing power becomes so difficult to extract from, right? Like Bitcoin's a highly defensible bearer asset, right? It's really hard to steal, as we touched on earlier. Well, that starts to throw off the calculus of taxation. And then, then that top-down pressure isn't going to be so good at cohering a tax base. And maybe we will see more fragmentation.
Yeah.
Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this episode, click here to find more just like it, and here to find our most recent episode. Also, make sure to like this video to help shine light on the corruption of money. And be sure to subscribe to this channel to stay connected.